right, I'd like to welcome everybody who's logged into today's webinar to the presentation titled Leading Through Adversity to Recovery. My name is Pat Lepofsky. I'm the founder and CEO of the Envision Group, and we'd like to say a special thanks to the North Dakota Petroleum Council for arranging today's session. Today's session is all about helping different organizations and each one of the leaders who are on the call today with a little bit of perspective to start, but some ideas, tactics, and strategy around the adverse environment that we're currently living in. On today's call, I've got a few different presenters. We have Scott Donald, who's one of our senior partners with Envision. Scott, would you mind just doing a brief introduction?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pat. Welcome, everybody. Hope everyone's well on this beautiful day. As Pat said, I'm one of the senior partners with the Envision Group. And as you can see from the picture there, that if anyone who's met me, that picture is about 10 years old, and I've aged quite well since then. Yeah, everyone, for those of you who have high expectations for the call this afternoon, you're well within your right to do so. We've got two excellent gentlemen who have put together a great presentation. And the feedback that we've got from working with the NDPC and other groups is that there's a lot of good value in here. So looking forward to sharing this information with you, and hopefully you'll come away with a couple of nuggets to help you and your team manage through this process.
All right, thanks, Scott. Now, also on the call, as Scott had mentioned, we've got two gentlemen that are really the stars of the show, you might say today. It's Dr. Hugh Dunleavy and Bob Peterson. Now, it's interesting because Hugh Dunleavy, he has been through some extreme leadership situations in terms of adversity when he was the chief commercial officer at Malaysia Airlines, and he helped lead that airline through two extreme periods of adversity with the loss of MH370 and again the loss 4 months later of MH17. Now, we'll hear from Hugh in just a moment on some of the learnings from that experience that could very well help each one of us move forward. As well, we have Bob Peterson, who I've known Bob for about 9 years now. Bob is an individual who, of course, is one of the top strategy consultants in the oil and gas industry across North America and internationally. Bob will introduce himself in just a moment. Bob has lived through 4 major price shock adjustments in the oil and gas industry, as well as helped organizations internationally through 2 major pandemics. Now, first off, Bob, would you mind just a brief introduction beyond that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pat. Certainly happy to be here this afternoon with the NDPC, and hopefully we can give you a bit of advice on how to begin to formulate and execute strategy in this new world. As Pat said, I've been in the industry over 40 years, multiple price shocks, several small pandemics, first time ever, both have come together, which makes it very, very unique. I have fond memories of North Dakota. In the early 80s, I started my career there on a field crew with Mobile in January. So a bit chilly, but a bit warmer today here in Dallas. We're probably about 90 degrees. So happy to join you guys.
All right, thanks very much, Bob. And Dr. Hugh Dunleavy, would you mind giving an introduction beyond opening comments? Hugh, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Well, welcome everyone. I've been in the airline industry for about 40 years and have worked all around the world with different airlines. And one of the key things about the aviation industry is not only is it hyper competitive, but that when the world has a sneeze, the airline industry gets pneumonia. That's how sensitive the airline industry is to issues. So you can imagine the level of impact that the pandemic has had on the industry. So as part of the presentation today, I'll be talking through some of the things that we encountered in that world and how a lot of it has a direct correlation to what we're seeing across all industries as we try and come to terms with the pandemic and the impact it is going to have on our industries and on our people. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Pat.
Yeah, thanks very much, Hugh. And again, just to those who don't me that I haven't met yet and that don't know me, my name is Pat Lepofsky. I'm the, again, founder and CEO of the Envision Group. Now, just as some backing, the Envision Group for the last few years now has actually been delivering the leadership training on behalf of the North Dakota Petroleum Council. Now, our focus and mandate is really as an organization, we help organizations align strategy and ownership behind that strategy in ways that delivers top tier performance. And Bob, Hugh, Scott, myself, we've got an expanded group beyond that. A few of our senior partners are on the call. I know Ted Lafferty, you're on the call as well. It's interesting because within our organization, what we enjoy doing is learning from top leaders internationally in ways that helps us build even more content and direction behind our work that we do with organizations. Today, we're going to be going through a situation, of course, looking back just a little over 6 years ago. Hugh was in a situation with Malaysia Airlines, of course, and Bob, with his experience with the oil and gas industry, we'll hear from Bob a little later on in the presentation, just taking you through the perspective of what had happened and how the leadership teams and the groups had really taken and worked through and assisted stakeholders, in some cases customers of the organizations, but also the team members of which, in really moving from an adverse position through to recovery and resumption. Now, we're going to be talking about these learnings from three perspectives, as you see on the agenda that's up on the screen right now, which is really talking about leading self. Now, each one of us on this call here today, as leaders, it's just very interesting because we do need to put our own oxygen mask on first and make sure that we're doing things to ensure that we are in a good position with a strong foundation as individuals, so that we can then go on to item number 4 on the agenda, which is leading teams. And leading teams, and it may not just be in a corporate sense. Many of you on the call today as senior people and as leaders within organizations may have responsibilities in community and responsibilities really for families as well. And finally, when we talk about leading organizations, which seems to be the big impetus today to ensure that organizations are moving forward, we'll talk about strategies and approach and ideas that we're starting to see deployed around the world in different capacities to leave some perspective and ideas for each one of you to leave the call with value in terms of driving some of the results that are needed most within your organizations. Okay. Now it's interesting because with Dr. Hugh, about 6+ years ago, you'd actually received a phone call at about 4:30 in the morning, Kuala Lumpur time, as you were driving out to the airport to attend an industry event. And really that phone call changed your life and the airline industry in many ways, but changed your life as we know it. Could you pick up the story from there, Hugh, and take it from there?
From an airline perspective and from my personal perspective, I'm going to try and talk through what we experienced at Malaysia Airlines dealing with a specific crisis and how that relates to what we're all going through today in dealing with the pandemic, and for some industries, the parallel impact of the oil price, which I know Bob will be talking about a little bit later. So as an airline, we practice all the time in terms of dealing with crises. We do lots of simulations, but they very rarely happen. And when we do a simulation, it's normally planned well in advance. It's at our headquarters, so we've got all the facilities and support we need. So when I am driving into the airport on that Saturday morning and I get an emergency call out, it comes as quite a surprise because I know nothing was scheduled, therefore what's going on? So I immediately got my driver to take me to the emergency ops center and then ask a few questions such as, okay, what's going on? What's the nature of the emergency? Only to be told that we as an airline have lost contact with one of our aircraft. We don't know what's going on. All that we can tell you is that our aircraft is not responding, but there's been no messages from any of the other airlines in the sky in that same area that anything has happened. And what we're trying to do at that point in time is get contact with the aircraft. So the first thing is we recognize we've got a problem. We just don't know where the problem is. And as we go through this presentation, you'll see a lot of similarities with when did the pandemic really start? When does the first phase end? Will there not be a second phase? And will we handle it correctly? So going through this quickly, the point being is that we didn't have any real idea of how severe this problem was going to be. It was going to become a worldwide mystery. We had no idea that that mystery related to the aircraft might never be solved. Typically, when an aircraft crashes, there's a lot of debris and you find things out and then you go into that investigation mode. Neither did we appreciate that depending on the culture of the people on board the aircraft, how big the scale of the support operation would be, nor how long that support operation would last. As it turned out, we spent more than 6 months in Beijing dealing with family members and making sure we took care of them. But we didn't know that at that initial point in time. We're learning a lot as we go along. Information is coming in. Not all information is accurate. And even with the best will in the world, as soon as there's a person involved in a communication loop, interpretations happen. Some information gets correctly responded, some doesn't. So what we learned very quickly was in these type of crisis situations, you have to communicate, communicate, and communicate. And if you don't communicate, people will invent stories. So the sooner you get on top of the situation, the better it's going to be. And therefore, it's very important to know your facts. However, there are lots of times where you don't know everything that you would like to know. And so one of the things we learned very quickly was, if you don't know some information, tell the people that you don't know the information, or you tell them that this information is the latest we have available, but it's going to be updated very quickly. We don't know when. And when it does get updated, we'll communicate that with you. If you don't, people will immediately think that, well, you told me this yesterday, now you're changing your story. And then conspiracy theories abound, even though they're not based on much information. The other thing we learned very quickly is take care of your people first. These are what we call first responders. If you don't take care of them, then it's impossible for them to take care of the family members of the passengers who are on board our aircraft. These people are going to be your frontline agents working with the families, and they're going to go through an enormous amount of stress. As you see from some of the photographs, people were very stressed out by the loss of the aircraft. That emotional stress is going to be translated onto your own people, only they're going to deal with hundreds, if not thousands of people, in fact, distressed family members, whereas each individual family, they definitely have a major stress in their own family because they've lost a family member. But our first responders are dealing with all of the family members. So take care of your people. We also didn't realize at the time just how important social media has become. Okay. I think we made our first press release at 9 o'clock in the morning because that was the time the plane was supposed to land in Beijing. Within an hour, the first conspiracy theories had been spread across the social media platforms that the plane was somehow in Diego Garcia. Another had the story and it was in Pakistan. Another one that we'd hidden the aircraft on an island off the coast of Malaysia. And what we found is if you don't respond quickly, those stories get spread that it's almost impossible to keep up. In addition, we had dedicated national agencies who are not necessarily your friends, organizing denial of service attacks, trying to hit your system and bring it down. Also, as a business, we're still transporting 45 to 50,000 people a day on the rest of our network. Those people still have to be supported. We still have to continue with our normal operations. But at the same time, you're also dealing with a major crisis. So that balancing act between doing the right thing for the customers you've already got on board or have booked with you, and at the same time, putting a lot of focus on dealing with the family members and the government agencies, both at home and in China, trying to address the needs of the family members. As you see some of the photographs there, we had to communicate. Initially, the request was from the family members that we would give them updates every 15 minutes on the search for the missing aircraft. Now, when it's an aircraft search, 15 minutes, an aircraft can go a considerable distance. If it's a seaborne search and the South Indian Ocean is an enormous area, ships don't go that very far every 15 minutes. Trying to convince family members that we couldn't give reasonable updates because nothing would have happened in 15 minutes was a major challenge. But we finally got through to them that if we gave them an update at 9 o'clock in the morning, 12 noon and 5 p.m. each day, that enough time would have elapsed that we could have given them updated information. And I will tell you, frequently, there was no more new information from 9 o'clock in the morning until 5 p.m. because not enough had happened. The ship may have moved to another area, but the searching and sonar equipment had not had a chance to be deployed and used to search another part of the seabed. So with that, the issue is you're in a deep crisis, lots of people are involved, lots of emotion, lots of your own team are involved. Some of your people actually, they're all well trained, but some of them cannot handle that stress. Doesn't make them bad people. It just means they're not equipped for that situation. So the other thing we learned is that if they're not equipped for that scenario, send them home and replace them. And I can tell you within the first few weeks of us arriving in Beijing, we probably went through about 1,000 of our first responders as we rotated them through there. Not just because some of them weren't able to handle the stress, but also because, quite frankly, the stress levels are so high on these people, you need to give them a break and get them out of there and back to base so they can get back to their lives and their families as well. So just recognize the level of stress, recognize the need to communicate, get information out there that's accurate, and stay on top of all the information sources that you receive, and then make sure that the information is validated. What you want to avoid most of all is knee-jerk reactions to every piece of information that's received, because tomorrow is a brand new day and it might be a whole different story on that day. So I'll handle that back to you now, Pat. The stress level is enormous on everyone involved. And as my role as the senior guy for the airline, I also became the senior guy in China dealing with the Chinese authorities. And the important point there is you have to be able to be calm, cool, and collected. Tell people that there is a plan ahead. This is what we're doing. Keep people informed and make sure that you're consistent in the information you provide. Because if you can't provide consistent information and you cannot provide leadership, then the rest of your people will not follow you. So with that, I'll hand that back to you, Pat.
And thank you, Hugh. You know, it's interesting because, you know, going through that whole tragedy and the emotion involved, and as a leader, of course, you know, it took some time. You know, 4 months into this, you're making progress. And again, the emotion that was involved, you know, daily briefings, what, 3 times a day?
Yes.
So daily briefings 3 times a day, and then all of a sudden what happens is, you know, tell us a little bit about what happened about 4 months later after living through MH370.
Yeah, so I touched on it a little bit earlier. From about 4 o'clock in the morning when I was first informed about the missing aircraft till about 9 o'clock in the morning was where we went from the depths of concern because we now knew something bad had happened. So it took us several hours to get there. When MH17 was shot down over the Ukraine, we happened to have a few other aircraft in the sky following the same flight path, as did Air India, as did KLM, Air France, British Airways. They're all following that same safe air traffic corridor, which as it turned out was not as safe as the United Nations portrayed it to be. So within literally a matter of minutes, we knew we had lost a second aircraft and that we're back into now recovery mode. But each crisis is a little bit different. In the case of MH370, we couldn't find the aircraft, and we still haven't found it now, almost 6 years later. In the case of MH17, we knew the aircraft had been shot down. We could see the wreckage on the ground, but because of the fighting between the various factions in the Ukraine, we could not get permission by the Ukrainian government to go down to the crash site for approximately 6 weeks after the event, simply because of the conflict area, which raises its own impact in terms of you and your brand and your people and what's going on. So, and then the conspiracy theories abound that it's related to the first aircraft, etc. And the image you see on the screen now is the reconstruction that we put together of the aircraft debris as part of our investigation with Boeing and the various aviation authorities to see if we could find out exactly what had happened. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Pat.
Yeah, and thanks, Hugh. You know, because looking at both tragedies and really looking at today, of course, COVID is much different than facing the loss of life, and I give you all the respect for that and your abilities to lead through. Now, what's interesting is you came away with learnings. You've summarized most of them now, and we've got these items listed on the screen right now. But you know, again, Hugh, you talked about look after your people, but also the communicate. You know, what would you say? All points on this slide are important, but what would you draw attention to in terms of today's COVID situation and the oil price shock?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. When we deal with an aircraft incident like this, we rapidly discovered that communication was one of the most important information, one of the most important media we could use. And the reason for that was that because there is loss of life involved and people want to know what has happened to their family members. They're very emotional. So getting out in front of them is the major issue. Now, Sometimes I had to give bad news to people, particularly when we told people, it is 13 hours since the time the aircraft left Kuala Lumpur. All I can tell you at the moment is we don't know where the aircraft is, but we can tell you it's not flying. That's a major traumatic statement for family members. But it's how you communicate that information is so critical. You can't be arrogant about it. You have to be empathetic to the family members you're with. And fortunately, there were some family members that could speak English, because I certainly don't speak Mandarin, and I could have conversations with them. With others, they were so distraught, they were so stressed out, they still wanted to speak to me, even though they knew I didn't speak the language. And the important point there is how you make them feel. They just wanted someone to sit down from Malaysia Airlines and listen to them. And frequently, my translator didn't actually need to do anything. They just needed to sit with me as well to let the family members know that we as a company and as an individual, we were listening to their needs. So I think that need to communicate, but also demonstrate empathy and concern and care for the family members was so important to get us all through that terrible situation.
Yeah, and thanks. You know what's interesting at this point, what I'd like to suggest is for those of you on the webinar, you do have a chat function by going into the bottom third of your screen with your mouse and highlighting over the conversation item. If there's any questions that you'd like to pose at this point moving forward, we'll do our very best to incorporate your questions into the presentation and make sure that if there are items that you have that you'd like to have brought up, just to leave this call and this webinar with the highest degree of value, we'd like to incorporate that in. Now, it's interesting because, Hugh, looking at this image that's on the screen right now, we call this the roller coaster of change. And over the last 3 months, you can only imagine each one of us have probably gone through each one of these, what we call the stages of change in what we're facing with the changes within the oil and gas industry, the changes within this COVID environment. And of course, we're seeing most recently over the last few days, a very substantial jump in cases. Now, that creates change for people, and this roller coaster has also been attuned to the stages that one would take in losing a loved one. So each one of these stages, when we go through change, when we go through personal change, recognize these, because each one of us can almost put the time of day and the day of the week that we were at one of these different positions. And it's nice to know in the sense that, again, recognizing that some people on your respective teams as leaders and within your respective families may be on the left side of the roller coaster versus the right side of the roller coaster. Now, Hugh, looking at, MH370, and then of course, a second wave of adversity and tragedy with MH17. With MH370, how long did it take you to go from the top left of that roller coaster from blind optimism down to the pit of despair?
That was probably about 5 hours. And
Okay.
I used that time in the sense that through those 5 hours, we were getting increasingly concerned with the continued lack of connection with the aircraft. But when we knew at 9 a.m. in the morning that the plane should have landed in Beijing and had never been picked up on Chinese radar, then we knew we had to really announce it to the world that the aircraft was missing and go into full mode. We'd already activated search, rescue, etc. But can you imagine telling search, air, sea, rescue, we've got a missing plane, and they're immediately going to ask you, okay, well, where was the plane last sighted? Where do you want us to go? And you have no real information to tell them. That was a real challenge. But that 5 hours was probably one of the toughest times for everyone at the airline, because it's something that was totally unexpected by us and by the country. The climb up on the right-hand side takes considerably longer. That was, I would say, at least 6 months to get back to renewed motivation, which actually got further delayed because of the advent of MH17, which caused a second peak or a second crisis. So that delayed even further what happened on the recovery side.
Well, Hugh, that brings up an important point, because you look at some of the changes we're all going through with COVID and the oil situation. Now, MH370, it took you a number of hours. With MH17, how long did it take you to go from the top left to the pit of despair?
Because of the nature of traveling over Europe, that probably took us less than 5 minutes to identify that it was our aircraft that was not responding.
Now, it's interesting because, looking at this, when navigating change, Hugh, I know that we've talked many times about this. Bob, we've talked, many times. There's really 4 phases of crisis management. And when you think about it, each one of us on the call, many of us have probably gone through some of these stages strategically, even personally already. Now, Scott, if you don't mind, like there's really 4 phases here. And we just wanted to get the group to hear from them, didn't we?
Yeah. So, excuse me. So, as Pat and Hugh pointed out, when you think about the roller coaster of change, these 4 phases align nicely with that in terms of recognizing the response to recovery and the resumption. And one of the things that we've been doing with different groups where we've done this presentation is get people to think of where they're at. So, as an individual, or as an organization, where do you feel that you are at in terms of managing this overall crisis? So there's the crisis of the pandemic, and there's the crisis of oil prices. So think for a second about whether you are still at the recognition phase. Are you more in the response phase? Do you feel like you've moved into recovery, or are you actually in full resumption? So, Pat pointed out that there is a chat function again. So if you move your mouse to the bottom, you'll see the chat function just off to the right-hand side of the hand. So we'd love to hear everyone's thoughts now. So take a second, think about where you are at as an individual in terms of the phases. Are you at the recognition phase? Have you moved to recovery, or are you in full resumption? So take a second. We'd love to get some of your thoughts and feedback in terms of where you feel you are at right now in terms of the recognition, response, recovery, or resumption.
All right, thanks, Josh. I see you put your number in as well, Hugh. Just type the number of the stage you think you're at. You as an individual, maybe even you and your team. Some people are at the point where, again, we've recognized there's a major issue and there's adversity out there. Have we begun to respond to it? Many have. Now, recovery is when you're taking the steps to get people back to work, when you're actually recovering and you're starting to strategically get back to work. And of course, resumption is getting right back to regular day-to-day business. And it's very interesting. We've been doing this presentation, Scott, now for how many months?
I think the first one we did would have been sometime in, I'm going to defer to Hugh and Bob as well, but did we do it as early as April?
So April, just over 2.5 months now, yeah. So
we're doing it for a while, and for the longest time we saw a lot of 1s and 2s, and based on some of the feedback, and we're still encouraging you guys to give us your thoughts. We want your interaction here. We want to see where the North Dakota team is at, because we do work closely with Ron and Carrie and the North Dakota Petroleum Council. We'd love to be able to give them a sense for what their members are saying. So for those of you that haven't given us your thoughts in terms of where you are, please feel free to click on that chat and give us a number here between 1 and 4. And then we'll be talking some more about each one of these phases as we go through this.
Yeah, so put some thought to that, and we'll return to this question as well as we go through the rest of the presentation, because look at some of the numbers that exist right now. These are the numbers we're looking at. Scott, both Scott and myself, we reside up north of the border between Canada and the U.S. Scott's in Winnipeg. I'm in Calgary. Hugh, of course, is in Austin, Texas, and Bob in Dallas. In the U.S., 326 million people. Canada is roughly about 1/10 of the population of the U.S. The total confirmed cases as of 9:45 a.m. Central Time this morning in the U.S. was around the world, was 9,463,000 roughly. U.S. cases was 2.3, almost 2.4 million, and in Canada 104,000. Normal mortality rate, and just granted, we're not medical professionals here, we're just reflecting the numbers from the Johns Hopkins website that's out there that many people are relying on. A normal mortality rate is about 0.88%. With COVID is 3.5. So you can see the difference between those numbers according to the actual medical professionals. But Bob, if you don't mind me drawing you into the conversation here, Bob Peterson, you look at the chart that's on the right here with the black, gray, and red. This chart is interesting because this was actually taken some time ago about return to work. What can you say about this chart?
Yeah, I think first it's a month plus old, and it was a survey taken of major CFOs from corporations. And the question was, how long do you think it will take for your firm to return to business as usual. And if you just kind of do a visual average there, the red, it looks like the view was somewhere in a 3 to 6 month interval. I think, and we'll talk more about the situation, very dynamic, very volatile. We're seeing a huge spike in the US. My guess is if you were to resurvey the CFOs today, we'd probably be hearing numbers on the order of 6 months to a year plus. So that just emphasizes how volatile and how basically unknown this situation is in terms of what will be the path through it back to some return to business as normal.
Yeah, and thanks, Bob. It's interesting because looking at the item that's noted on the bottom left in red, and this is according to the experts again, talking about fully getting to phase 4 and fully restarting the world economy is completely dependent on health-based strategies and, more important, some deployment of a vaccine. So until we start to hear some certainty around both those items of progress, we can pretty much look at leading and managing through exactly the same scenario that we're in now for a number of months. The estimate is another 10 to 18 months, according to experts, and it keeps on getting extended out. Now, what's interesting is as of 9:50 a.m. Central Time this morning, I took an image of the 5-year price chart of oil. And what's interesting is you can see that at one point, it almost looked like they might have had a frozen chart that wound up in the heat of Houston, and it melted back in March. And you look at that big drop. Bob, what can you say about this chart?
Well, the good news is for us in the energy industry, we're seeing demand begin to return pretty aggressively, in particular consumption of transportation fuel as more people begin to go out and drive about. I think the big question is, will the demand recovery continue as we may see the next half of the first wave? So again, uncertainty, but the good news in this chart, Pat, is if you look at all of the oil producing provinces in all of the world, break even is about $40 a barrel. Now, we know it's a little higher in the Bakken, but it's good. It's we're beginning to see a slow paced return to normal in energy. Now, there's still, in our view, there'll be a lot of changes within the industry, but it's a good trend, and let's hope that it continues.
Absolutely, and the trend seems to be coming up right now, and we're hoping that it continues on for some time. Now, what's interesting is as we deal with this whole and we lead and manage through these uncertain times, again, the first part is really leading self and looking at the same 4 phases that Scott had noted before, where we've all recognized what's going on. Many of us are still responding. Some of us feel that we're actually beginning to recover and get back to some sense of a new normal. But of course, resumption to what it was like back before March 16th or even March 13th might be still a phase and a ways off for many of us. Now, it's interesting because, Scott, we've redone the roller coaster of change shown earlier. What can you say about this image that's on the screen? We've redrawn this.
So I think that the key takeaway from this, you're looking at some of the traits that somebody might be going through. So you'll see, I'm not going to read the entire chart, but you're seeing that somebody is dealing with fear and seeing sense of threat, guilt, depression, and then on the right-hand side is more acceptance and moving on. I think the key message from this chart for all of us as leaders is to be cognizant of where we are on the chart, and probably even more importantly is to be cognizant of where our team is at. So I think Hugh touched on this, that you may have people who are at different stages. You may still have people that are dealing with disillusionment and fear and threat, and you've got others that are dealing with acceptance and are moving on. And it's our opportunity as leaders to recognize those things, and again, as Hugh said, to communicate with them. So communicate doesn't just mean talking to them, but it also means listening to them. So the takeaway from this chart is assess where you're at, assess where your team is at, and then you're better prepared to be able to help people as they move from the left to the right-hand side of the curve.
Well, and Hugh, if you don't mind me bringing you back into the conversation here, I know there's two questions many people on these calls, like we put literally thousands of people through this presentation over the last 2.5 months. And what's interesting is, one of the biggest questions comes up is A, have they ever found MH370? And B, what did you do as a leader to help people through these different emotions to the point of acceptance? So maybe, Hugh, if you don't mind addressing both those questions.
Yeah, well, contrary to conspiracy theories, I don't know where the aircraft is, and it's highly unlikely that we'll find it in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Of course, that assessment could be blown away tomorrow if someone accidentally finds it. But basically, we believe it's somewhere in the South Indian Ocean, but it's highly mountainous and it's a very deep ocean and it's a huge space. So I can't really add much more to that. What I can tell you, though, is one of the things that you learn very quickly is that people don't necessarily remember what you say to them when you're going through these extreme emotional challenges, such as the loss of a loved one, family members, etc. But it is important that you sit with them and let them know that they're being heard, that you're aware of their emotions and that you care about them. In dealing with the loss of life type tragedies, particularly if a family member in Beijing has not just lost a parent, but have maybe lost a son, the son's wife, and 2 of their children, etc. So it's a huge impact on their family. The level of stress that they're facing and the level of anger that they express, that they feel they need to express, can get very high indeed. So certainly the feeling that we were not answering all their questions as quickly as they expected, even if their expectations were unrealistic, you can't just dismiss them. You have to sit with them, listen to them, and know that they're being heard. So, and it's a real challenge to help people go through that roller coaster and get to that phase of acceptance and moving on. Some of these people may never get to that stage because it's had such a major impact on their life and that of their family.
Well, Hugh, you've even said before, we're gifted with 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. If you see people are on the left-hand side of this roller coaster, the gift is to sit and listen and let them let some pressure out of the tires, especially during this scary time during COVID, during the changes in the oil industry. So it's interesting. And then the right side, of course, this is where we get people, refocused back on track and thinking about the future.
And I think, in all fairness, the type of information we have received over the past several months, probably unrealistic expectations of finding an aircraft, corresponds to unrealistic expectations of finding a vaccine for the COVID-19 within 3 to 6 months. That's very, very optimistic. And as people go through time and they start seeing that these early optimistic statements were not being fulfilled, there's a risk that you get this disillusionment. Oh, it's just people saying things. The problem is people are trying to keep people upbeat. They're giving them optimistic projections, but in their heart, they know if I tell you it's 5 years away before we have any real chance of getting a vaccine, then that's such a disillusionment, particularly for people who don't have a scientific background, regular members of the population. That's not their forte. They just think people are just not working hard enough to get a solution for them. That's not what really is happening, but you have to recognize that people are going through those phases. And even if you can get them to move from one phase onto the next phase and onto the next phase, the next piece of information they receive can put them right back to a previous phase on that cycle of change. So it is very dynamic, it's very unstable. And the best you can do is pay attention to their needs and listen to them. As Pat said, 2 ears, 1 mouth. Listen and help them get through it. That's the most important thing that you can do at this stage.
Well, and just to come up with, Hugh, we've talked about this before, but, Scott, like you look at these items, although everything on here, these are items to consider to really build resilience in others. Like if you picked one item on this screen here, Scott, what would you say is one of the more important things that you've been helping people over the last 2-3 months with?
Yeah, that's a really good question because as you can see from the list, every one of these is super important. I would suggest from a foundational perspective, the physical part of it, right? So making sure that you're taking, again, if we're talking about self, are you sleeping properly? Are you taking care of yourself physically? Are you eating well? Are you getting exercise? Are you doing all the things you need to do to take care of yourself? Because if you're able to take care of yourself, you're now better able to take care of others. So while all four of these are super important from a resilience standpoint, I'm going to say start with the physical, and then everything else builds off of that.
Right on. Now, Bob, how about you? What would you say is the most important thing to you on this list to ensure that leaders on this call, maybe take away as a little heating and some something to think about?
Yeah, certainly like Scott, I look at these four areas as a system. So you should be thinking about what are you doing for yourself in each of the four. But if I were to pick the area where I spend a lot of time in the last several months, it's in the psychological area, working with companies, working with teams, helping them understand that there is a path through the double shock of Corona and energy. The world is not going to end. The world will return to normal. And it's important, you as a leader, to find a core of positive belief there. And your followers will build off your emotions and your energy.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely critical for you to see a positive outcome through some path here and be able to communicate it.
Absolutely. And how about you, Hugh? What really jumps out at you on this page?
Yeah, as Scott said, all of them are very, very important. But to add to what Bob was saying, I think as a leader in that organization, you have to be calm. If you're panicking and reacting to every single piece of information without having time to evaluate the quality of the information, is it reliable? Can I use it to communicate? Then you're going to be jumping all over the place. So calm, collected, professional, analytical are really important in terms of communicating with people, but on one level. But on the second level, as I mentioned before, the ability to listen, demonstrate compassion, empathy also plays a major role in toning down some of the emotions. You have to let people go through that emotional stage. At the same time, we also recognize you can't stay in one stage forever. You have to help them move through that. So having leadership that takes care of their own people, because one person cannot do it on their own, but also being visible to the family members, to your colleagues and to your workers, that's also important so that they can express their feelings to you as well and understand what you as a leadership team are doing for your company and for the organization.
No, thank you for that, Hugh. So it's interesting. That's some very good tips to really make sure that we're leading ourselves. And as they say in the airline industry, Hugh, we're putting our oxygen mask on first so that we're best equipped to help those around us do the same.
Exactly.
Now it's interesting because leading teams is also, for those of you on the call who may not even have direct reports, we lead families, we lead in community, we lead on sports teams and the arts. There's a number of different pursuits. But what we really come down to, and there's four specific items that we really see in times of crisis, after spending time talking with both Bob and Hugh and multiple leaders around the world, many actually who are even on this call. I know John Coop, you and I from you from CalFrac, we've had conversations. Here's four items, and Scott, if you don't mind summarizing each one of these for us, that'd be great.
Sure. So I'm going to ride Hugh's coattails again, and he talked about look after your people. So that's table stakes, right? That's foundational, and we're all doing it. And this is just a nice reminder that if you're doing this, then great. This is affirmation, and if you feel like you can do a better job of it, then great. Now's a good chance to really take after your people. But the next one is while you may not have all the answers, to work with your team to create a vision of what this will look like when it's over. So give people something positive to work towards. And it may be something small, it may be something towards the end of the week or towards the end of the month, but you're painting a vision of how things will be better at the end of the crisis. It's actually borrowing from a tool that we use called Living Above the Line, which anyone who's been in our training with the NDPC has been about that. The third one I think is fantastic, and this whole notion of encourage and empower others. Again, this is one of the greatest things that we can do as leaders, is to extend that influence, extend that responsibility beyond ourselves, and let people on our team. It's a quick story. I was coaching somebody, a follow-up coaching call this week with somebody who always felt like they had to control the outcomes, and they've worked really hard over the last several weeks at being better at sharing and including other people and delegating the task. And she could not believe how much participation came out of it and how empowered people felt. And she said, I didn't realize how many good ideas people had. So, there's a real value in letting go and delegating to people so they can be part of the solution. And again, as Hugh said, acknowledge these are difficult times. This is we're in uncharted territory, and we keep hearing the term the new normal. Well, every week or every month is a new version of the new normal. So it's okay to acknowledge that and to share that with everybody, so that they all realize that even you as a leader who is calm and collected and providing a vision of the future, you recognize that we're all challenged to get through this, and by working together, we're more likely to have a positive outcome.
Absolutely. Thanks, Scott. And it's interesting too, the intersection between these three items, other people's perspective, other people's emotion, where they on that roller coaster of emotional change, but also a little bit of withholding judgment from time to time as well. Because, Hugh, in your situation, when you were sitting with people, you could have, if you had leaders that were exercising immediate judgment, would that have taken away from other people's right to really move forward and grieve for what changes and what catastrophe had just happened?
No, it absolutely would, Pat. The challenge is it tends to be a normal default for people to go there based on our own experiences and our own characteristics. We do tend to judge too quickly. So in this case, we spent a lot of time with our teams having meetings every morning to see how their previous day went, what would be the challenges coming up in the day, and how we wanted people to approach them. Just sit and listen. We were fortunate to be able to have people who actually spoke Mandarin, so that we're able to get that language barrier overcome very quickly. But it's still very important to sit there and listen and understand the emotional stress that they're going through. So withholding judgment is a key issue, and that's what we wanted our people to do. You're not there to judge them. You're there to listen, take care of them, take away any stress levels they've got as much as we can in terms of where they're living, how they're going to pay for their food, etc., making sure we took all those stresses away while we went through the search for the aircraft.
Yeah, and these are all great reminders. And looking at this next image here, Scott, you talked about this because, this is a time, I know that we deliver this to anybody who's had members on their team go through the NDPC training. You may see this model card, is what we call it, sitting on their desks or used in conversation, but it's the whole concept of living above the line, because we are facing change. We are facing challenges right now, but you don't want people to live below that green line, because they resemble three words, don't they, Scott?
Right. So below the line, you're seeing very much that negative mindset, right? You're blaming other people, you're making excuses, you're denying the situation. And it's pretty easy, particularly in these times, for us to get caught living below the line. And science shows us that we're kind of built to be negative, to be fearful. And, as Pat indicated, this is a couple hours that we're doing a quick dive into, but the real trick as a leader is to bring ourselves and our team above the line and take ownership and take accountability and responsibility. And quite frankly, and this is the discussion I alluded to in the coaching call that I had earlier, was when this individual started realizing that they could say to other people, well, what do you think we should be doing? Or what do you think this is going to look like when it's fixed? And just flipping that switch and getting people to think about something positive and a positive outcome, and asking for their input. It's such a simple tool, but I think Pat will agree with me that by and large, of all the things that we work with from a training perspective with the NDPC, this is by far the most popular one, and has the most impact on leaders as they sort of change their mindset, how they interact with their team. So, live below the line long enough to gather the details, and then flip that switch, get above the line, and start looking at solutions and how you can fix things and how they'll look when things are better.
Yeah. More better, as you always say in our
more
trainings,
how they can look more better.
So this is interesting because, Bob, if you looked at this image on the screen right now, I know these are all, again, important facts for leading teams, leading families, being a leader in community. What would the number one item be on this list for you?
For me, in the current environment, I think it's very important for individuals, teams, and organizations to be flexible and agile. And so I advocate, and I'll talk a bit more about this when we talk about strategy, is develop the 80% plan. Because if you spend the additional time required to develop the 100% solution to how you respond to the virus, the environment will probably have changed and your plan will no longer be valid. So it's important to be flexible, adaptable, and be looking for the signposts about how this new world is playing out.
And thanks for that, Bob. You know, for Hugh, which item really stands out for you on this?
Yeah, I'm going to use a different one this time because I've used some of the others in previous presentations. But one thing that I also believe we sometimes underestimate is that building trust and accountability. We touched a little bit earlier, one person cannot do it all. So you have to have your own team work with you. They're going to take care of your customers or the family members, etc. And then you also have to give them authority to make decisions without always having to come back to you. Then you happen to get it to the CEO, and the CEO needs to go to the board, etc. Sometimes these crises require decisions to be made at the front line, and that one of the issues of having really good people in your organization is that you give them the trust that they will make the right decision, and that when sometimes those decisions don't turn out to be the best they could be, then you have to have their back to make sure that, hey, not every decision we make will be 100% perfect. We'll make some mistakes along the way, or it was a good decision at the time, but now the world has moved on. Let's not worry about that now. Let's keep moving forward. So build trust and accountability within your own team so they can build trust and accountability with the people you're dealing with is also an important characteristic that sometimes we underestimate how important it is to get the strength of your organization out there, all doing the best they can.
Yeah, and you know, thanks for that, Hugh, because great leaders ask questions, especially during difficult times. Now, Scott, which one stands out for you before we move into the strategic part?
Well, I'm going to give myself a pat on the back here because I was literally just thinking I'm going to change it. I'm going to change this up, and I was going to go with build trust and accountability. And this is why I hate following Hugh, because he stole the one that I was going to take. But because these are all really important, I'm going to go back to what both Bob and Hugh have both alluded to already, which is communicate, communicate, communicate. So that means being available. That means sharing the information that you have. And as both Bob and Hugh have already talked about, and Pat, you mentioned this too, there's a reason that we have two ears and one mouth, and that's to listen. So while I can't go with build trust and accountability, I'll give a check mark for that, and I'll add communicate, communicate, communicate.
No, thanks for that. You know, and Hugh, you know, one item as we look at the whole idea of leading organizations on many of the calls, and again, please feel free if you have any questions. We've had many great questions posted in the past. Throw it into the chat if you've got anything that you want us to address in terms of a question, because on many calls before, we've had the question come up, you know, Dr. Hugh, you look at, you know, you spent 4 straight months every single day, 3 times a day, addressing the families and the stakeholders of MH370, and then you had to go through the same situation. Well, you were privileged to go through the same situation to help those after MH17. The question was always, how did you maintain your own sanity and position as a leader through both periods of adversity? Wasn't it something that was trying on you and maybe have at times had taken away from you?
When I look back on those days now, I also wonder myself, how did I get through them? However, when you're going through the crisis itself, you are so busy dealing with all of the stakeholders, all of whom have important issues that need to be resolved and they need your time. You became so busy in it. And I can tell you that probably my entire team didn't get an hour's sleep in the first 48 hours that we arrived in Beijing, simply because you needed to pay attention to the needs of the family members. So yeah, I think it is about also maturity as well. And that sounds arrogant, and I really don't mean it that way. But I think it is about, you're going to exercise all the learnings and all the training and all the experience you've gained over the years when you get to a C-level executive, and now deploy those back and say, the first thing you got to do is motivate and guide your staff so that when anything does crop up, and anything can, then they've got someone to go to. You're not going to panic about it, but you're going to assess what they've told you and then give direction and guidance. And most of the time, just by asking them a couple of key questions, they will come up with the solution themselves because they're the ones facing it on the front line. So helping them get there themselves also improves the buy-in, also improves their confidence to handle more issues in the future. So it is a learning process, and I must admit, there was a component of this that you're not sure what the world is going to throw at you tomorrow, but you deal with what you can today and move forward. Keep moving forward.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Hugh. Again, it's interesting because, the whole steps moving forward, sometimes many of us on the call just don't even realize how much stress we're really under. There's people on this call that have gone, well, many of us on this call who've gone through attrition within our respective organizations, and we've had to say maybe it's a temporary goodbye, maybe it is a goodbye to some people that we really cared about and that we've enjoyed many, many years as colleagues with. Now we're at the position, and Bob, if you don't mind me pulling you into the conversation, leading organizations through 4 major episodes of price shock and 2 minor pandemics, H1N1 and SARS, amidst others. Would you mind just taking it over from here in terms of leading organizations?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pat. And I think if I reflect back on my oil and gas career and the various changes that I had to deal with, there was an era in the 90s to early 2000s, which was all about consolidation, scale, and the beginning of the growth of the international or the national oil companies. And then it was a pretty traumatic decade, but we got through it. The next decade or so was the 2000s to 2010, which was kind of a good era in that it was lots of growth. Super majors grew. The shale business was basically invented, and it grew to substantial production here in the U.S. And now the decade that we're in now, 2010 to 2020 plus, has been one of a lot of volatility, probably 3 major price shocks, several pandemics, and I think it's kind of the forecast of what's the future going to look like. So that implies to us as individuals, leaders of teams, and leaders of companies, we've got to be flexible. We have to be adaptable. We have to find ways to see a path through the change that results in a positive outcome.
Absolutely.
And, one last comment, Pat. I was talking yesterday to senior airline exec who was the founder of JetBlue, and he kind of pointed out to me that the virus, is not showing any preference for people or companies or countries. So unique to this situation, whilst every country and every company and every person in the world is affected, the good news is we're all affected. So it's to a certain extent a level playing field in terms of how do we reset and reconstruct our strategy. So.
And it's interesting, Bob, we had to talk about resetting strategy. A question was posted on the chat here. Hugh, if, looking at the current environment and even, pairing on Bob's comments just a moment ago, just imagine if the plane crash had happened during the pandemic, what would have been, would there have been a different response if the MH370 would have happened during a pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that's a great question. And it quite frankly, it's not easy to answer because it would depend on when during the pandemic had travelers, reduced dramatically. As I've seen airlines who are saying we're actually operating only 4%, 5% of our fleet on any given day. So we're significantly down in terms of travelers, etc. But if you're early on in the pandemic and people are still flying in certain countries, have not seen the impact of the pandemic, and we've got a relatively full flight like we had on that night, then I suspect we would have followed through as we did today and ended up in Beijing taking care of the family members. But as more information was released and the scale of the pandemic was recognized, then we'd follow into the same process. We'd make sure we wore personal protective equipment, etc. That would move on. If, however, you're way into the pandemic period and very few people are flying, now it's a tricky situation because there are distressed family members, but maybe due to shutdowns and closing of cities, the family members can't even get to Beijing to talk to the airline. So it's very difficult for me to answer that question. It is a great question, but it would all depend on the specifics of the scenario. Where am I in the pandemic? And am I still able to travel with my people, or am I even prevented from traveling? Because if I go outside the country, I may not be allowed back in if China is an embargoed country, for example. So we would have to do like most things. That's what they paid the executives for. Consider the situation, assess the positives and negatives of each side, and then decide what's best to be done, not for me as the company, but for the family members that have been impacted. But with the big proviso, I also have to take care of the needs of my staff, because they have families as well, and putting them in harm's way is not something I would like to do. So I would have modified that process and probably had fewer people on average in China to take care of the family members.
Yeah, no, and thanks for that, Hugh, because again, it's always when you do a little bit of looking at different situations, the recovery could have been different depending on the scenario planning that you were going through. But one thing that I can say for certain, it's many of us on the call here wish we could actually be flying around. I know between the four of us as partners of Envision, we're usually spending 2 or 3 weeks a month on an aircraft. During the business week, for me to feel normal strategically, I've got to sit beside my dryer with my iPad with scenery going by to feel normal again, with a bunch of pillows packed around me like I'm in business class. But it's interesting. There's strategic business considerations, aren't there, Bob? When you're looking at strategy as an organization in a pandemic situation, what can you really say about that, and what really would you like to highlight on this slide?
Yeah, maybe reflect first on, we had light voting in our poll, but it looks like, the consensus is of the participants, we are in the recovery phase, which is good. And with respect to that, Pat, I think each firm's recovery path is different and it's unique, and there will be temporary changes and there will be permanent changes to the environment, the competitive landscape, and the industry itself. We do know that likely organizational design will be significantly affected. I think we're all discovering, those of us who are maybe more, I'd say, knowledge workers, that you can actually get real work accomplished and even maybe more effectively using Zoom and Teams and remote communication. I think firms, oilfield service firms in particular, are discovering that perhaps the supply chain needs to be rethought. High risk areas need to be brought closer to home. Multiple partners need to be arranged for risk reduction. And as Hugh has said, whatever the plan is from recovery to resumption, is incredibly important that that's clearly communicated throughout the organization, and each individual understands his or her role in carrying out that plan. Because, as humans, I think we touched on this earlier, we all like to feel we have a bit of control over what the future is going to look like. And so to the extent we can connect the folks we work with or the folks we lead with your company's plan and their contribution to it, the better off we all will be. So.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, Bob, looking at strategy, the question was posed. We've had this question before as well. And I remember Hugh sitting with you one evening overseas after one of our sessions, strategy sessions. I said, Hugh, looking back, if you had to go through that situation again, what would you do different? And your response when we were sitting down in Frankfurt was actually quite interesting. And it's, so the question was posed, if you had to go through the tragedy and have to lead stakeholders, families, people through, what would you do? What would you do different based on the last 2 times you've had to be in a leadership position through something like that?
Yeah, when I was in Beijing, I was at the main hotel where we had most of the family members. To give you a scale, we took over 5 hotels in Beijing, So, and we had maybe 1,500 family members we were dealing with. But we designated one hotel as a key point of communications where all of the family briefings, media updates, etc. would take place. So I stayed there. And it was important to be visible, not hidden away in a hotel room and guarded by security service people. And so I went out on a sort of maybe a couple of days a week, meeting with family members, just sitting down and literally ensuring I was being visible. If I was going through that scenario again, I would have spent even more time in front of the family members so they had someone to sit down and talk to, because it is important that they communicate with someone that they feel is accountable for the airline and representing that airline and the country in China. So I would spend more time with them. That sometimes it can be very stressful depending on how angry the family members are. But that's your job as part of being the executive team, is to take that. You do not want your first responders having to deal with it and you're hiding away in a room. So I'd spend even more time with family members.
Yeah, Hugh, and that was something that that you'd responded. You'd also mentioned that, the one thing you do different is you just sit and listen to people. And that's good advice heeded, because as leaders, I know everybody in this call has all that available spare time. And I'm being facetious with my comments. It's interesting because you did make the comment that in hindsight, you would actually, you would have just made more time to listen to people and stay connected to them.
That's exactly right. It's important to listen. In many cases, I didn't even need a translator to tell me what was going on. You could just tell it from the emotion and the body language. In other cases, people wanted to just show you photographs of their family members that had now been lost on board the aircraft, and then it would become very emotional for them. But at least they had someone to express that emotion to. Do not underestimate how important that is. And going through this pandemic, we don't know exactly what stresses our staff are going through. Have their husband or wife lost their jobs? Has a child lost their jobs, etc.? God forbid, have some of them, had family members who've lost their lives to the pandemic because of underlying health conditions, etc. Those things we may not know about as an executive in an organization, and you won't know about it unless you're available for people to speak to you about it. And I know in a large, multinational organization that's impossible, but you can do it in the area where you're living and the team that are around you and the people that you work with. It is important for them to see that you're visible and paying attention to what's going on in their lives as well. Even if there's not much you can do about it, the very fact that you listen is very important to them.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because looking at the strategy that's deployed when going through times like this, of course, Bob, not to go into a basic review, but there's really three components to a solid strategy, no matter what time and what situation people are leading through. What can you say about this?
Yeah, I think, and strategy is, the practice of strategy, as a bit of background, is pretty timeless. It comes from the Greek word stratos, which means the art of the general. And, basically the three components are making choices about where and how you will compete to achieve competitive advantage. That hasn't changed. The framework is, what are the structures and processes you put in place in order to execute? That hasn't changed. And then putting in place a measurement system to ensure you're achieving your objectives, that hasn't changed either. But what has really changed is the volatility of the current environment and the need to be agile and flexible. And that starts at the CEO level and ripples down to the strategy planning teams and ripples down to operations and teams and also individuals. So it's a big challenge to be able to create a culture where people embrace and actually pursue change. It runs against human nature.
Well, it's interesting because, does your company have a response plan? I'd probably gather that most every or a leader on today's call has strategy around their response and maybe even starting to think about resumption. But, if you do have a strategy, really, what is it? What can you say about this question?
Yeah, I think it's important. This kind of response plan leads into recovery. And so I think, we'll talk about this in a bit. I think I'm betting all of your firms have already been through response. So how do we take care of our people? How do we react to the imminent threat of the coronavirus? And how do we begin to think about responding to the oil shock? So I think most of your firms are beyond that, and we're now into the next slide, Scott, which is Pat, what's the recovery plan?
Yeah, so does your company have a plan? Here's a few more points on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then I think we define recovery as the short-term response.
Yeah.
So most of your firms may be, I don't know, back to 25 to 50% of normal activity. And that may persist for, maybe as long as 18 months. So what are the actions that your firm is taking in the short term to basically preserve and protect your cash position, understand how your market and your sector is changing in terms of bankruptcies, consolidations, what opportunities may be emerging as energy goes through this tremendous change? Are there some opportunities, for example, to move into adjacent industries? We have a client who has some really good water technology who is now looking at moving from energy into municipal and commercial water systems, for example. Do you maybe, I like to use the term, do you need to shrink to grow? Do you need to leave geographies or leave segments in order to consolidate back to the core of your company so that you have enough cash and enough horsepower to begin to take care of advantages as they present themselves?
Absolutely. It's interesting, Bob, because many of these questions are the answers to these questions aligned not just at the senior level of your organization, but are they aligned down in levels below you within the organization? Because some of these might be immediate, some might be survival imperatives too.
Yeah, and I think we touched on most of these, Pat, but it's really about positioning and strengthening the core of the firm to be able to come out the other side when we get to I don't particularly like this term, when we get to a new normal or a different operating environment, are we best positioned to be competitive?
Well, and here's a question then, like in the short term, for people on today's call on the webinar, are you likely dealing with disruptions in the following core areas, and what are you really doing? We just intended these as to get people thinking, right?
Yeah, and I think we've touched on a number of these areas, Pat, but certainly how teams work and interact has been significantly affected, by the working at a distance requirements, huge demands on IT and cybersecurity. If you're in the real world where you deal with tangible goods and items, then you have likely already dealt with and maybe fixed short-term supply chain interruptions. And then those of us who are in businesses where we sell to clients and we interact with clients, then there is the challenge as to how can we do this at a distance. Sales and more so sales and marketing has always been a face-to-face contact sport. So how do we, as firms and individual contributors, how do we adapt quickly to keep that process moving on?
Absolutely. Now, Demita, thank you very much for this question that's in the chat. You found that one plan was not enough. Many offices in various regional spots for your organization are hot spots where there are low infection rates. How have others really adapted plans based on location? What have you been seeing, Bob? I know that Hugh may have comments on this as well, but what have you seen in terms of adapting plans based on location?
Yeah, well, I think certainly maybe not so much in energy, but you see this in retail. If you look at large retail chains, large restaurant chains, depending, like in the United States, depending where they are and what the rate of incidence is, they have adapted different, they're in different phases of recovery. You know, certain hotspots in the US, restaurants are still at just the takeout phase. Areas that have maybe too aggressively moved to recovery, like Texas, restaurants are already back to 50% capacity. So it's kind of watching the key metrics relative to your business and then having flexibility tailored to the local environment. I know Hugh's got some comments, likely from his airline experience as well.
Yeah, I mean, I totally understand how important it is for us to get the world business environment back and running. I think we're all aware of that. We all want that to happen. The challenge, of course, is if we make the decision to rush to that scenario too quickly, we actually run the risk of being very counterproductive. And instead of getting into a normal decline of the infection curve, we just extend it for longer with a greater overall impact, negative impact on the world economy. Just an example, this week, Emirates had a flight from Dubai to Hong Kong. When it landed in Hong Kong, 29 people had COVID. So the entire plane is embargoed. The airline will probably be stopped from flying to Hong Kong for quite some time. A week or so earlier, another airline was flying into Athens. Same issue type occurred. So then they quarantine everyone and embargo the airline for another several weeks to find out what's going on. As Bob said, some states here have probably opened far too quickly. There was probably a component of we need to get people back to work, very legitimate economic objective, but the politicization of the COVID has also been a major factor here. So sometimes we're also throwing out the science because it's an inconvenient truth. Yeah. And therefore, when people start making decisions based on political issues rather than on scientific and objective goals, then we end up making short-term decisions that have longer-term negative consequences. So, sorry, long comment, but the reality is no one knows perfectly when is the right time to do these things. There is a component of trial and error, and it should be thought that, yes, I'm going to relax my restrictions, but I'm telling you up front, if I relax them and I start seeing a surge, I'm going to slap them on very, very quickly, not have 3 weeks debate. And that's something we haven't been doing very well here in the States, unfortunately. And we could well now be embargoed by the Europeans saying US flights are no longer allowed into Europe. I don't think the decision has been made yet, but we certainly don't have it under control. So we need to be careful. We need to be able to adapt quickly when the data doesn't reflect our optimistic perceptions of what should be happening.
Well, and it's important at this point as well, and Bob, I wouldn't mind if you comment on this, because the importance of not just having a short-term plan when resuming and even considering resumption, but it's as a leadership team, it's coming together to talk about the major processes that have been impacted, the risk factors of Corona and of oil price shock, and to set a plan, and then to include others in on this plan as well, right?
Yeah, I fully agree, Pat. And I think, we chose, in this case, looking at the sales process, right, which I had commented earlier, is typically face-to-face, very human interactive, lunches, etc. Well, that's all been pretty much changed by the requirements by authorities to work at a distance. So then I think the first response, the recovery is, so what's our playbook in order to transition as quickly as we can to this selling at a distance work process? Do we have the right support infrastructure, in particular IT? And maybe there's a requirement, maybe not so much in oilfield service or energy, but in other sectors, maybe what we sell, how we bundle it needs to be different based upon this new selling dynamic. And then I'd add a fourth column, Pat, is what do we think resumption will look like? Worst case, best case in terms of sales and customer management. What are the signals that will tell us which of these two scenarios is most likely to play out? And then what actions do we need to take? Are we, best case, will we have a vaccine in a year? And will we then be able to just rapidly phase back to the normal sales process? Or are we stuck with this world for maybe 2 years? And is there a next level of evolution or innovation that we need to apply to our sales process?
Well, absolutely. And that actually brings up another question too, because, longer term, how has our competitive position changed during this time, during this environment? What do we need to change internally, externally, and what do we need to stop doing? Looking at these major areas. So do you mind continuing with that?
Yeah, and I think we've touched on a lot of these points here, but virtually, well, I'd say most industries are going to be structurally changed on the other side of the coronavirus pandemic. Certainly energy will be, certainly airlines. And so we advocate firms thinking about what does that future look like? And where are the advantages to us? As I mentioned earlier, are there acquisition opportunities? Are there adjacent market opportunities? Are there geographies that maybe we want to leave, or geographies that we want to enter? Are there joint venture partnerships that did not make sense in the normal working environment that we should think about? And so it's thinking about, in a very positive sense, how do we move our chess pieces on the board so that we as a firm can be in a advantaged position in 1 to 2 years.
Go ahead, Bob.
One last comment, Pat. I think what's really critically important is to identify, in order to have the critical mass to pursue these changes, is what should we stop doing? How do we retract back to the core? I used the term earlier. A lot of firms are thinking shrink to grow, repositioning. That's important.
Well, and it's interesting because one of the questions, Bob, that was up on the chat here is, much of the discussion has been focused on decision making within a shifting decision environment. And on our next slide, we'll talk about one approach to this. But has anyone deployed the formal or informal decision analysis, like the example is the PROACT model, and has it been useful in moving people and teams forward? So what's interesting, just in relation to that question, one of the items that's through Envision that we've done for some time is we call these our strategy pyramids, and they're intended to actually get the leadership group, not just the senior executives, but the leadership groups, one function at a time, one area at a time, just looking at the foundational elements of the business, what have been impacted. Which work controls have been adjusted or shifted, what's needed for work improvement, continuous improvement, and to return to high functioning efforts. Now, the one you're looking at right now has to do with operations. We've got other areas that we'll highlight in just a moment. But, Bob, even on this tool to get people thinking forward, you've highlighted a few of these boxes in red for a purpose, haven't you?
Yeah, and this tool, Pat, is something we had developed pre-coronavirus, and it's intended for each of the major process areas to be an assessment of how well we are doing as a firm. The red boxes we've highlighted post-corona to identify the areas that likely are most affected and need the most attention in terms of re-engineering how energy firms, for example, go about operations. So this is just one instrument. I'm not familiar with what PROACT is, but I am very familiar with scenario-based decision analysis. So you could likely take the operations pyramid and blend it with a worst case, best case scenario. You can even estimate probability of outcome, and then you could identify, I call them telltales, significant signals from data or the market as to which scenario path we might be going down, or is a third one beginning to evolve?
Yeah, and Bob, pre-COVID, it's been a lot of fun using this as a tool in advance of doing strategy work and even strategic training to align strategy through different organizations. It's nice to hand tools like this off to others. The legend at the bottom speaks it all. Is your organization you can't manage what you don't measure is a very important statement. And looking at this tool, if you looked at one box at a time, you might require a little bit of description on some of these boxes. It's spoken in a bit of a lean Six Sigma language. But if you're green in each box, it means on a scale of 1 to 10, you're probably 8 out of 10. If you're yellow, you're 5 to 7, and red would be 0 to 4. And hopefully nobody's 0. But the fact is it's a great measurement tool to get people thinking more strategically and in terms of what's needed most for their area of the team. Now, the types of pyramids we have, commercial for the overall corporation is the commercial pyramid. Operations, of course, speaks itself. It's the operational area. You may have maintenance. Many of us, of course, technology and IT, communications and marketing. John Coop, HR and talent. You could almost write something like this on your own. Business development, of course, for those who are doing BD, not just sales, because that's only a portion of it. And of course, finance. So you look at the major functional areas of the organization. We've developed tools to help get that strategic thinking to levels to help cascade strategy and really align it one organization at a time. Now, just in summary, Bob, just looking at this slide here, just in summary, what would you say, again, everything on this slide is important, but what would you guide people towards during this COVID/oil adjustment period? And what would your comments on this be?
Yeah, and we've respectively touched and elaborated on all of these points here, Pat, you, Hugh, and Scott. But I would just close out with one of my favorite sayings, which I learned from a major general who had served 3 tours of duty in Vietnam, certainly seen a lot of chaos. And, his counsel to me has always been, Bob, the best way out is through. You need a plan, you need options on your plan, and everyone needs to understand their role. And they need to communicate as a leader that there is, a world on the other side of all of this chaos.
And thanks for that. And Scott, I know that you've always been a big fan of formulating teams around key strategy issues or areas. Just in closing, can you say anything beyond that?
You know what? I'm gonna leave that one for a second, because the one that I wanted to touch on, and I know it's been beat down a little bit here, but I'm looking at this now and looking at it in a new light in terms of a lot of what we do with the leadership training talks about people's and their soft skills and their emotional intelligence. So given all that we've been seeing and hearing over the last number of weeks and learning from you and Hugh and Bob, I really feel like that first one, taking care of people first with empathy and confidence, is my key takeaway from this presentation, and hopefully other people see the value in that one as well.
Right on, and thank you for that. And Hugh, in closing, what would you really like to punch home on this slide here?
The key point for me is flexibility, because there are so many unknowns. And we don't know the scale of the impact of many of those unknowns and how that can change over time. Trying to pretend we can put an absolute plan together. Bob touched on it, the 80% plan and no plan survives first contact with the enemy type thing. I think having a really strong team with good ideas, and I touched on that in answer to one of the chat questions, the quality of your team is going to be very important, because we are going to require some innovative ideas to see how we respond to what the world will look like post-pandemic. And I don't know what that outlook will look like, but I'd certainly be wanting a high-skilled team to be working with me to say, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if something else happens? And be able to have some ideas of how we would respond in each of those scenarios. That, I think, is going to be critical for those companies that want to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that will definitely arise as a result of the pandemic. I know we tend to focus on the downside, but with every downside, there's the opportunity to take advantage of slower performing competitors. So we should be prepared for that and make sure we've got good quality team members to work with us on developing new solutions.
Absolutely. No, I just want to see a huge thanks to the North Dakota Petroleum Council, to Ron Ness, to Carrie Cutting, the rest of the council for really setting up today's call. Again, our Envision team, we've been so proud to be delivering leadership training on behalf of the council that's for industry and created by industry, people we've worked with internationally. You know, at Envision, our whole focus really is on strategy. We do leadership training to back that up. Our focus is to align strategy, to encourage ownership that is aligned in ways that delivers top tier performance. Now, our contact information, info at Envision Group, is on the screen. If you want a personal copy of the deck that we took you through today, please email us. We'll send it off to you. Second thing is, if there are strategic issues or challenges, we'd love to connect. We'd love to talk about them and help out. And we're here on behalf of the council to do what we can to keep people employed in our industry and to keep the health of organizations through and through. So thanks for today. We hope you took some value out of our conversation. Hope you took a few key points out of this. But we'd like to say thanks very much, and we want to wish everybody all of their very best and our very best to you in continuing to keep health in the oil and gas industry within the Bakken region and beyond. I know there's people on the call from Houston and other places. But Scott, any final comments before we sign off?
No, basically it's the same as what you said. It has been an absolute pleasure and an honor to work with the North Dakota Petroleum Council. We're very flattered that we have the opportunity to work with people like Ron and Carrie, and we're glad that you were able to take time out of your day to join us today. Hopefully it caused you to reflect on some things. Hopefully you took away a couple of nuggets, and hopefully we'll see you all soon live at some point in the very near future.
All right, guys, thanks very much. And that's all for today. If there's any comments, feel free to leave them. We look forward to reconnecting in the near future together. So thanks very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.